the previous video we debunked the myth that poverty is a root cause of terrorism. In this video we will explore the assumption that terrorists are crazy, insane or psychotic. Well, the logic behind this assumption is simple. How is it possible? How can we imagine why people would kill innocent victims? Why they would even, in some cases, kill themselves in the act? Well, in many societies, this is regarded as a kind of behavior that is at least difficult to understand. In particular, the idea of suicide attacks. And that raises many questions. How can somebody do a thing like that? And the answer very often is, these people must be insane. And there are examples of persons whose behavior, both as terrorists or in court, feed the idea of crazy terrorists. But are they? Are they different from us? Do they suffer from any social, psychological disorder? Or are they not that dissimilar from people who do not commit terrorist attacks? Or in other words, are they perhaps quite similar to you and me? Here you see the faces of a number of alleged and convicted terrorists. And many people have said that these persons were crazy. From left to right, first you see Ted Kaczynski, the so-called Unabomber who amongst others sent bomb letters to universities. And then Anders Breivik, the man who killed so many people in Norway a few years ago. And in the middle you see the face of Richard Reed, the so-called shoe bomber who tried to blow up a plane with a bomb that was hidden in his shoes. And then Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, who didn't do the attack himself, but he planned it. Can he be considered crazy or not? And then finally, Major Nidal Hassan, working for the US Armed Forces, a psychiatrist who killed 13 of his colleagues in Fort Hood, Texas. Were they crazy or not? Are they really that much different from us? Well, I guess and I hope that many of you find it very difficult to understand how somebody can send a bomb letter knowing that people will be injured or killed. Or how somebody, like the case of Richard Reed, tries to blow up a plane or plan the killing of thousands in New York or kill his fellow colleagues. Often such violent acts evoke strong moral outrage that impedes us from an objective and proper analysis of the rationale and state of mind of terrorists. And because such acts are generally strongly condemned for good reasons, there is a tendency to regard these people as fundamentally different from us. Comparisons to mass murderers are easily drawn, and the same holds for school shooters. And we know that in quite a few cases, mass murderers and school shooters have been diagnosed with mental illnesses. And oftentimes terrorists are put in that same category. A same category of persons who use indiscriminate and random violence. But there are differences. The main difference between mass murderers and school shooters on the one hand and terrorists on the other is that the former are not politically motivated, and terrorists are, if we at least agree on the definition that terrorism is an instrument to achieve certain political goals. Well, in other words, there seems to be a fundamental difference in terms of rationality. And if there is rationality in the act, and if this is regarded as part of a mechanism that is linked to some ideological idea, can you still call this act crazy or the behavior of an insane person? I would like to stress that understanding the rationale behind these acts doesn't mean you cannot condemn it at the same time. So understanding doesn't mean condoning. And you might also want to still consider this kind of rationality as an example of crazy thinking. I mean, terms like crazy, insane are subjective concepts. So are they crazy or not? It's a difficult question, difficult to define and difficult to answer. Why is it nonetheless important to answer these questions? If many terrorists indeed suffer from mental illnesses, it has consequences for counterterrorism. It might require more cooperation with actors in mental health care. And at the same time, it might lead to the conclusion that there's little we can do, as in every society there are people with all kinds of illnesses, mental illnesses, disorders, and we cannot jail everybody just because they are not like you and I. And another consequence of this assumption is that there's no use in investigating the motivations, the rationale of terrorist groups or terrorist individuals. I mean, there is no motivation and rationale, they're simply crazy. Well, how have scholars and experts dealt with these questions? In the second week, we discussed the approaches in the study of terrorism, among them the rational or instrumental approach. Well, this approach strongly rejects the idea that terrorists are crazy. Terrorism is a rational behavior, making terrorists rational actors that kill to achieve certain political goals. So they don't kill because they're crazy, they kill to achieve something. And also within the second approach in terrorism studies, the socio-psychological approach, there is consensus that terrorists are not crazy. Gerald Post, for instance, one of the leading scholars in the field of the psychology of terrorists and author of the book The Mind of the Terrorist, is very clear on the question whether or not terrorists are very different from us. He stated, "It is not going too far to assert that terrorists are psychologically normal, that is, not clinically psychotic." And he also said, "They are not depressed and not severely emotionally disturbed, nor are they crazed fanatics. In fact, terrorist groups and organizations regularly weed out emotionally unstable individuals. They represent, after all, a security risk." So even the organizations, they're very keen not to allow crazy people to be part of their organization, according to Gerald Post. And then Louise Richardson. She noted, "At the level of the individual, psychologists have long argued that there is no particular terrorist personality, and that the notion of terrorists as crazed fanatics is not consistent with the plentiful empirical evidence available." And allow me to also mention the Israeli scholar Ehud Sprinzak, who would regard terrorists as fanatics. Yes, they are fanatic, but he would also call them rational fanatics, even to describe suicide bombers. This is not to say that there are no terrorists that are clinically psychotic, to use the term of Gerald Post. And there are some scholars that have observed mental disturbances, disorders among terrorists that are more frequent among them than among the general population. And I would also like to stress that the lack of empirical evidence is partly related to the fact that it's very difficult to diagnose terrorists. Very few scholars have had the opportunity to interview and monitor terrorists the way psychiatrists normally can. Nonetheless, there's very little empirical evidence that suggests that terrorists are crazy. And many scholars agree on the rationality of their behavior. But more research is needed. That is why I would not label this assumption a myth. I would label it false. In sum, we've explored the idea that terrorists are crazy. And although many people find it difficult to understand the behavior of terrorists, in particular that of suicide terrorists, academic research has shown that terrorists are, clinically speaking, normal. This means the assumption that terrorists are crazy is false. In the next video, we will explore the idea that terrorism is increasingly becoming lethal.